for having obtained our speaker that we're all honored and pleased to have in attendance today. Dick Henning, please. Thank you.
H.R. McMaster is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and at Stanford University. A native of Philadelphia, he graduated from the U.S. Military Academy in 1984. He served as an Army officer for 34 years and retired as a lieutenant general in 2018. He remained on active duty while serving as the assistant to the president for national security affairs. He taught history at West Point and holds a PhD in history from the University of Northern Carolina at Chapel Hill. He is the author of the best-selling classic Dereliction of Duty and his most recent Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World. I want to thank Laura Garcia in your office. She was very responsive, helpful, and always seemed to be in a great mood. Now, General, I turn the microphone over to you.
Unmute.
I have to unmute, General. While you're unmuting, I will.
We can hear you.
You hear me now?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, the external mic wasn't working. So, hey, what a privilege to be with everybody. Thanks for having me. There's a lot to talk about, obviously, in connection with especially the catastrophe that's unfolding in Afghanistan. But what I thought I might do is just focus my initial remarks on that and see where you'd like to take the conversation for the rest of the time that we have together. So I write in Battlegrounds about this lack of strategic competence that I think has been a plague, for our country and our interests, and cut against our interests since the end of the Cold War. And I define strategic narcissism as the tendency to define the world only in relation to us and to assume that what we do or decide not to do is decisive toward achieving a favorable outcome. And of course, the problem with that is it's self-referential, this approach to foreign policy and to national security, and it doesn't consider the agency, the influence, the authorship over the future that others have. And I think this is the dynamic this is the main reason why we've encountered so much difficulty in Afghanistan since 2001. And in the book, I write about the 1990s as a period of increasing confidence based on our victory over the Soviet Union in the Cold War and the breakup of the Soviet Union that resulted from that, as well as the lopsided military victory over the fourth largest army in the world during Operation Desert Storm. And those twin victories led to this increasing optimism and I think even a touch of hubris, in which we looked at the world based, I think, on through the lens of three fundamentally flawed assumptions. The first of these was that an arc of history had guaranteed the freedom and security and the primacy of our free and open societies over authoritarian closed systems. A second and related assumption was that great power competition was a relic of the past. And a third, especially based on the Gulf War experience, was that America's technological military prowess would guarantee our security well into the future, and that if any foe had the temerity to challenge the United States, that war would be quick, cheap, and efficient, and waged mainly from over the horizon or from standoff range. And I think these assumptions and the optimism and touch of hubris that underpin them were a setup. They were a setup for strategic shocks and disappointments in the 2000s. Foremost among them was the most destructive terrorist attack in history, the mass murder attacks of 9/11, during which Al-Qaeda murdered nearly 3,000 Americans and wounded tens of thousands more, and took trillions of dollars out of the U.S. economy. Of course, Al-Qaeda bypassed our technological military prowess using box cutters and airplanes to inflict those losses on our country. And then I think the next disappointment was the unanticipated length and difficulty of the wars both in Afghanistan and in Iraq. And while we often debate, should we have done it, like it being the invasion of Iraq in 2003, I think what we ought to debate more often is who the hell thought it would be easy? And why did they think it would be easy to unseat the government of Saddam Hussein? But both wars in Afghanistan, Iraq, and I write about this extensively in Battlegrounds, suffered from what was essentially a short-term approach to long-term problems. And that short-term and flawed approach to both wars actually lengthened those wars and made them more costly. I think if you add to that then the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, that led to our confidence really being shaken and the emotional impetus behind foreign policy shifting from over-optimism, I think, to pessimism and resignation. And whereas I think it is a justified and criticism of the George W. Bush administration that his administration undervalued the risks and costs of action, like the invasion of Iraq. I think it's also fair to say that the Obama administration undervalued the risks and costs of inaction in connection with the unenforced red line in Syria, for example, the complete withdrawal of forces from Iraq in December 2011, when then Vice President Biden called President Obama and said, "Thank you for allowing me to end this goddamn war." And of course, what's wrong with that approach is, hey, wars don't end when one side disengages. And Al-Qaeda in Iraq didn't look around and say, "Oh, yeah, the Americans are gone. I guess we'll just stop." And Al-Qaeda in Iraq morphed into Al-Qaeda in Iraq 2.0, which was ISIS, and became the most destructive terrorist organization in history, controlling territory the size of Britain and conducting almost 200 attacks internationally, all across Europe and the Middle East, and inspiring attacks in the United States as well. And so what you have, I think now, and what you see in Afghanistan is a continuation of this problem, this fundamental flaw of strategic narcissism. Yeah, in Afghanistan, if you think about our record there, we underwhelmed the effort initially in connection with what was necessary to consolidate a tremendous military success in 2001 into a sustainable political outcome. And then as the insurgency grew in Afghanistan, aided and abetted by Al-Qaeda and the Pakistan's inter-service intelligence, we continue to be in denial, right, and declare the mission over and say that we're going to withdraw our forces. In fact, over all the years in Afghanistan, our consistent messages has been, "Hey, we're leaving. Okay, now we're really leaving. Okay, now we're on our way out the door." And of course, that short-term approach led to, I think, a psychological effect that bolstered the Taliban's confidence and ability, and created a tendency towards hedging behavior on the part of Afghans, hedging behavior that involved preparing for a civil war that would follow, and the behavior of groups that were engaged in a range of corruption and organized crime activity aimed to build up their power base in advance of the post-US Afghanistan, which we kept telling them was just right around the corner. And so in Afghanistan, though, strategic narcissism adopted a really extreme form, in that what we did over the years is we actually conjured up the enemy that we would prefer to fight in Afghanistan rather than the actual enemy that we were fighting. And this begins really with the Obama administration and the 2009 decision by President Obama to announce a reinforced security effort, and then at the same time to announce the schedule for our withdrawal, and then to engage in negotiations with the Taliban after we told them we're leaving on a certain schedule. I mean, how does that work? I think in the annals of military history, there's never been an example where any party to a conflict has been able to achieve a favorable outcome, by first retreating and then negotiating. And so that really, I think, began mistakes across multiple administrations. I do believe that the Trump administration, when I was National Security Advisor, and I helped to drive the process that resulted in this decision, was the first time in a speech that President Trump gave in August of 2017 that we had a reasoned and sustainable approach to Afghanistan and South Asia overall. But soon after I left, the president actually abandoned that and doubled down on the flaws of the Obama administration, negotiating an agreement with the Taliban again after announcing that we were leaving. And then that resulted in a concession after concession and a capitulation agreement, really, in February of 2020. And I think this is really important, I think, for all Americans to understand. We surrendered to a terrorist organization. So when we look at the 12 American servicemen who were killed today in Kabul, I mean, did we expect something different when we surrendered to a terrorist organization? And so we continued on the path of concession after concession, forcing the Afghans in 2020 to release 5,000 of some of the most heinous people on earth, who immediately went back to terrorizing the Afghan people. We didn't insist on a ceasefire. After delivering the blow to the Afghan government's legitimacy of not allowing them to enter into the negotiations, we began to bludgeon them to do more for peace. And what was the Taliban doing at this time? At the time that we were telling Ashraf Ghani to do more for peace, Hibatullah Akhundzada, the head of the Taliban, was organizing attacks against maternity hospitals, where they were gunning down expectant mothers and infants, or against girls' schools, where they were detonating a bomb in the schools and then detonating secondary bombs outside to kill more young schoolgirls. So we were continued to delude ourselves about this enemy. And the elements of delusion, I think, are worth recounting. First, that the Taliban had kind of changed, right? The Taliban would become a more benign, organization. You still hear reporters parroting this today as if it has any kind of resemblance to reality and realities on the ground. The second is that there's this bold line, between the Taliban and other jihadist terrorist organizations. Okay, Siraj Haqqani is the number two in the Taliban. He's the military commander, and he's a prominent Al Qaeda figure, and he's in charge of security in Kabul. Right. So how could it be that this bomb occurred there? It must not be the Taliban, right? They didn't want that to happen. That was ISIS Khorasan. I mean, that is completely delusional. The Haqqani network lies at the nexus of Al Qaeda, of ISIS, and the Pakistan's ISI, and the Taliban. And I am certain, I don't even need to see the intelligence to know that the Taliban warned us about that attack, while at the same time they planned and implemented it. Because really what they want to do is continue to string us along. So we will continue to supplicate to them in Kabul while they humiliate us as much as they can on our way out, and they declare victory over the world's only superpower. So that's the second element of delusion, that there's a bold line between these groups. And the third element of this delusion is essentially that I guess there won't be any negative consequences, right, of surrendering to the Taliban or a lost war, right? It wasn't worth it, right? It wasn't worth it to sustain our effort in this endless war in Afghanistan. Well, I think what we're seeing is the reality. We're just seeing the beginning of this humanitarian catastrophe of colossal scale. And we're just seeing the beginning of a security catastrophe. All the terrorists that were in prison in Afghanistan are now out of prison. They will take full advantage of the chaos of a refugee crisis, and they'll take full advantage of the Islamic Emirate of Afghanistan, which will give them safe haven and support base and access to areas that they can use to plan, prepare, train for, and then implement terrorist operations. We know, right, when these groups control territory, they become orders of magnitude more dangerous. This is what happened with Al Qaeda prior to 9/11. It's what happened with ISIS in Iraq and in Syria, and it's what's happening again now. So what's going to happen next, based on our self-delusion? Well, we're already seeing the humanitarian catastrophe. Next, we'll see the waves associated with the refugee crisis, which will rival the refugee crisis associated with the serial episodes of mass homicide, which is the Syrian civil war. That will destabilize countries in Central and South Asia, especially Pakistan and the Central Asian states of Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, and maybe even Kazakhstan, and Turkmenistan. And those jihadist terrorists will take advantage of that destabilization to gain more control of territory and recruit more people to the cause based on their great victory in Khorasan, right? And they will use the passage from the Quran about the black flags marching, out of Khorasan to expand the Islamic Emirate and force the world, to live under their perverted interpretation of Islam. That is really their ambition. Yep. And so you're going to have this massive crisis that is going to strengthen jihadist terrorist groups, and we'll see more and more planned, prepared, executed, directed, as well as inspired attacks globally. And then also there's a reputational crisis we have to deal with. Remember the Biden administration slogan, "America's back," right? Who do you think is going to listen to that with a straight face? How about our allies after our capricious withdrawal and we left them hanging in the lurch? They can't even get their own citizens out. How about the serial embarrassments that we're going to have associated with the next crisis, right? The crisis now is, I think, evocative of the 1975 retreat from Saigon, but we're on fast forward to the 1979 hostage crisis in Tehran. The Haqqani network is known for two things: mass murder attacks against civilians and kidnapping Americans. So So this is going to play out over a long, long time. And the damage to our reputation as our president hosts a great, democracy conference in December. How do you do that with a straight face, right? So I think that that this is a disaster for us. And unless we radically, change course in terms of the way we think about the enemy and the grave threats that are growing as a result of our surrender to the Taliban, that we will pay the price, much as we did when Al Qaeda, declared war on us in the early '90s, executed the first World Trade Center bombing in, I think it was 1993, bombed our embassies in 1998, and we took our over the horizon, whatever the heck that is, approach to counterterrorism, and fired a few cruise missiles and called it a day. That was in 1998, and we know what happened in September 2001. So I think that we ought to all be profoundly disappointed in our leaders across multiple administrations. And I guess the question is, are any of us going to give a damn or care enough to demand better from our political class, which has delivered this disaster to us? So with that, I guess, I'd love to hear where you'd like to take the conversation. I'm sorry I didn't have more of an uplifting message for you.
That was quite sobering, General. Thank you very much for being here today with us. We do have some questions, and first of all, we want to thank you for being here.
Great, thanks.
Many people have asked in different ways, how come our military leaders left a ton of military equipment in Afghanistan now in the hands of the Taliban? Is there any attempt to bring that equipment back to the U.S. or to destroy it, or do we just leave it there?
Well, Harry, our military forces and commanders were given the mission to withdraw at all costs. That was the mission, right? The mission wasn't try to set up the Afghan government and security forces for success. In fact, everything we did bolstered the Taliban and weakened the Afghan government. And I would have to tell you that I think the main reason is that our leaders in Washington just didn't give a damn. They didn't care. The mission was withdrawal. That's the mission you have right now, too, which is why you see this massive attack. The mission was not, it'd be interesting to see what mission the president gave the Department of Defense and Secretary Austin. But was it to get every American citizen out? Was it to get every Afghan that was in imminent danger because they fought alongside us and supported our mission there? Or was it just get the hell out and make it look as least disastrous as possible? I think it was the latter. I don't think that if our mission had been to actually get everybody out, that you would have withdrawn your military before you withdrew civilians. How's that possible? And the prioritization, this crazy prioritization to, I guess, score some political points with his constituents, whoever they are, to get the last 2,500 troops out. And then what were we compelled to do immediately was to deploy 7,000 more after we withdrew the 2,500 that were actually enabling, operations by the Afghan security forces, and we're at an airfield that was much more manageable and easier to secure than this half airfield that we're in control of, right bumped up against a dense urban area. It's just it is the most astounding example of incompetence that I've seen in my career.
Now, we have a number of questions and some raised hands, but I've asked everyone to send their questions through me so I can distill them for you, General. One of the next ones is, okay, it's catastrophic. What would you have done to improve upon the situation over the past years?
Well, we had a sustainable policy in place, right? And, by 2018, we had reversed a lot of kind of the crazy aspects of the Obama administration policy of actually not having the Taliban as a declared enemy anymore, right? We couldn't even actively target the Taliban as they were killing our soldiers and committing mass murder against Afghans. I mean, how does that work in war? And we took the timeline off so that we would eventually, be able to convince the Taliban they could not accomplish their objectives through the use of force. And we endeavored to strengthen and harden the Afghan state and Afghan security forces against the regenerative capacity of the Taliban. In doing that, we built a force that was reliant on our asymmetrical capabilities, right? Our asymmetrical capabilities are certainly, our surveillance and reconnaissance capabilities tied to our air power. And the Taliban, they have some asymmetrical advantages too, which are mainly their unscrupulousness and their willingness to kill innocents, to use fear in pursuit of their criminal and political objectives. So what we did when we removed our asymmetrical advantages is we did nothing to counter the Taliban's and set the Afghans up for failure. The other aspect of that strategy, besides eliminating the timeline, was to put our advisors back at a level where they can make a difference, right? By bringing in air power more discreetly, both not only to be more effective against the enemy, but to do a better job at discriminating between non-combatants and enemy forces. And then we also treated Pakistan based on Pakistan's behavior, right? Pakistan's support for these organizations that were killing our soldiers and killing Afghans. All of that was reversed after I left, and I think it was reversed mainly based on the arguments that are made by the neo-isolationist far right, right? So we have a situation, I think, in which our will to sustain our effort in Afghanistan was eroded by what I would call maybe the self-loathing far left and the bigoted neo-isolationist far right.
Well, we certainly know that we live in a political world with extremes. You, from what I've read about your writings, you seem to advocate that we should have taken a middle approach, to leave some kind of force there to protect our country against future terrorist acts. Is that right?
Well, I mean, you know what it was an insurance premium to pay, right? I think it's worth pointing out, we weren't taking any casualties. The Afghans were bearing the brunt of the fight, and they were bearing the brunt of the fight against an enemy that we see today. It's not just the enemy of Afghanistan, they're the enemies of all humanity, right? And what we were doing with that small force is preventing what you're seeing today. Was it worth it? I would say hell yes. It's already become much more costly to do what we're doing now. We were spending, I think it's worth pointing out, we're spending the equivalent of 2.5% of our defense budget to sustain our effort in Afghanistan. But what was the narrative, right? It's unsustainable. We have to end the endless wars. It was completely sustainable. But at the time of our withdrawal, there were about 3 times more European troops in Afghanistan than US troops. I mean, the burden sharing was well underway in that connection. Was Afghanistan still going to be a ward of the international community? Yes. Was Afghanistan going to be Denmark? Hell no. But Afghanistan didn't need to be Denmark. It just needed to be Afghanistan without the Taliban in charge. And I'm just wondering, hey, when is it going to be that we stop empowering the Taliban? Right? You still hear people talking in the administration today. Well, we need to have a conversation with the Taliban about the future of Afghanistan. Hey, man, how about having a conversation with the Afghans who are not the Taliban about the future of Afghanistan? And why are we empowering a group that is connected to jihadist terrorists, that is the enemy of all humanity, and has support at its highest level ever of only 13% of Afghans, according to the Asia Society, which has been doing polls across the country, for the last 20 years. So, I'll just tell you, I think we fundamentally misunderstood the war. I don't think Americans know a damn thing about Afghanistan. I mean, really, how many people, you take a quiz, I guess, how many people could name the 3 main Taliban groups that we're fighting, could name their leaders and who they are? How many people know that Hibatullah Akhundzada, who's the head of the Taliban, that his son was a suicide bomber, who his father sent to his death in Helmand province in 2017? And then, maybe if more people knew that, the next time you heard our Secretary of State say, well, the international community is going to express its deep dissatisfaction to the Taliban. Okay, you're talking about a guy who had his son commit mass murder by suicide. Okay, so I just think that we are just delusional and ignorant of the enemy that we're fighting and what is at stake.
So tell us, General, let's say we're talking to a young soldier starting his infantry officer basic course. In light of what's happened this past year or 20 years, whatever your historical perspective, what advice do you have for that individual?
I'm just going to tell them, hey, you're needed now more than ever, right? Because this is just the beginning. And we're going to have to recommit forces against these enemies of all civilized people. This is a modern day frontier, what we're witnessing between barbarism and civilization. And it's been our soldiers who have protected us from this enemy. And I would say that our soldiers are both warriors and humanitarians for that main reason. And so I would tell our soldiers and our young men and women who are thinking about service that we need you now more than ever. And if you want evidence, about whether or not your commitment, our commitment over 20 years to Afghanistan was a noble endeavor, look at what's happening now, right? It was our forces that were preventing this humanitarian catastrophe. And I think even as we can express our profound disappointment, our disgust, Harry, at what's happening, I think we can at the same time maybe take a moment to have pride in what our soldiers accomplished and prevented from happening over all those years.
What comments do you have about our intelligence system, the CIA, the FBI, and the impact of this going forward?
I think they've done a great job. I think the CIA saw this happening. I think anybody with eyes saw this happening, right? Anybody who tells you this was an intel failure, it's just a lie. It's a lie. So how do we get Donald Trump, right, in August of 2017 to make a decision that cut against his predilections, right? Everything he'd said in the election, right? Afghanistan, wasted, trillions of dollars. We just need to get out of there. And the way we did it was we showed him what it looks like when we got out of there. And this is the picture we painted, Harry. We said, this is what's going to happen if we prioritize withdrawal over everything else. And so this was wholly predictable. I think the CIA has done a decent job over the years there, a very good job actually. But you know what? They just lost access, Harry. I mean, this idea that over the horizon intel against jihadist terrorists, it's a pipe dream, right? And it's the human intelligence networks, and it's actually the physical access, right? Our aircraft that conduct this kind of surveillance that's important to gaining situational understanding along with human intelligence, they're now based in Doha, Qatar, right? And just the flight time it takes that eats up the time, what we call time on station, right? To be able to conduct that kind of surveillance. So by prioritizing complete withdrawal, we have hamstrung as well our intelligence and counterterrorism efforts. And again, it's worth pointing out, it wasn't us doing those operations primarily, right? It was Afghan special operations forces mainly that were bearing the brunt against these jihadist terrorist groups, enabled by us, and as I mentioned, at a very, very low cost.
Now, during this entire war effort, we actually went with two prongs. There was the military prong, but there's also the reconstruction prong. And I know there's a special inspector general for Afghanistan reconstruction, John Sopko, who's testified before Congress before, who's testified basically that our money helped simply fund the corruption that went on. We increased the corruption.
I think that's right. I mean, that's absolutely right. Now, I mean, that doesn't mean we had to continue right on that path. I mean, I led a task force that was oriented on corruption and organized crime in Afghanistan. And what we decided to do is, okay, well, let's first not be the problem, right? Let's not create the problem. And so we created all sorts of different incentives and structures for contracting, for example, transportation contracts. There was a good report that had come out by a Congressional Research Service right before I formed this task force and so forth. How about not contracting with anybody in Taliban-controlled territory, right? If you do that, the Taliban is going to engage in all kinds of rent-seeking behavior and taxation, and you might as well just cut a check right to the Taliban, right? So stopping that idiocy. How about that? How about ensuring that criminalized patronage networks weren't hollowing out the state institutions and especially the security forces as we were trying to build them? These are networks that were incentivized again to build up their power base in advance of a post-U.S. Afghanistan, and I'll tell you, partnering with key leaders within the Afghan government, I think we made some progress on that. Hey, again, though, Afghanistan wasn't Denmark, okay? There was corruption there, but the mission was to reduce the threat of corruption and organized crime such that it was no longer fatal to the Afghan state. And whereas you have all sorts of reasons to be unhappy with the Afghan government, who do you like better? Do you like Ashraf Ghani better, or do you like Habibatullah Akhundzada? And I think that it's important to remember, again, no short-term solutions to long-term problems. Harry, the analogy that I think is useful is South Korea, right? South Korea was a flawed ally, man. I mean, we fought for a destructive war, very costly war for 3 years. After the armistice, with the situation we were facing, was a country that was ravaged by decades of war and brutal occupation, a population that was illiterate, a corrupt government, and a hostile neighbor. and it looked pretty damn bleak. And we have to remember, hey, it wasn't until the economic reforms of the 70s and the governance reform of the 80s that South Korea really took off. Kim Jong-il in 1967, 1968 thought America was weak, right? We're weak because of social unrest and protests against the Vietnam War. So he launched a major insurgency against the U.S. and South Korea. We had 15 U.S. soldiers killed and 65 wounded in 1 year in South Korea during the height of the Vietnam War. You know, and we didn't leave, right? We didn't leave. And if you look now, we have 30,000 troops there still, right? Was it worth it? I don't know. I mean, look north of the 38th parallel and compare that to south of the 38th parallel. What do you think? Was it worth it, right? So I really think that we have talked ourselves into defeat. What is sad about this, as the Taliban declares victory over the world's superpower, is that they didn't win. We defeated ourselves.
I've heard you say that. I was glad you pivoted away from Afghanistan for a minute, because we have a few questions about that subject. What effect do you think all of these past events will have upon NATO? And a related question, what will happen if China attacks Taiwan?
Yeah. Well, deterrence, which is why we're in these alliances, right, is to deter aggression that could lead to war, right, or to deter the use of military force to accomplish objectives. And who are the powers we're trying to deter are both Russia and China. Both of them sense weakness on our part, and I think that this is analogous again to really two decisions by the Obama administration: the complete withdrawal from Iraq and the unenforced red line in Syria, 2013 to 2014. I believe you can draw a direct line from those decisions to Russia's annexation of Crimea and invasion of Ukraine, and to China's building of violence and weaponizing islands in the South China Sea. And so that's the situation we're in. I think we're in an extremely dangerous situation. Russia's already massed troops in Belarus and along the border of Ukraine and eastern Ukraine and in Crimea. He's already upped missile capabilities and so forth around the Black Sea, to essentially in an effort to turn the Black Sea into a Russian lake. And why does he want to do it? He wants to do it to challenge the United States, but then also to bludgeon some of our more staunch allies, Romania and Bulgaria in particular. This message is basically, who's your daddy? Is his message. And he's going to amplify, of course, our surrender to the Taliban and withdraw under humiliating circumstances in Afghanistan to do that. And then you already see, if you can stomach it, you can go to the China Daily webpage and see what the Chinese are saying. And they're basically saying to the Taiwanese, hey, do you think America's got your back? You might want to think again. Hey, might want to think about accommodating with us now on our terms. And so you're going to see, I think, this effort to increase coercion, to accomplish objectives, to really create, in China's case, exclusionary areas of primacy across the Indo-Pacific region, and to challenge the U.S. globally, and for Russia to break apart NATO, and to reestablish Novo Russia, right? So, and to do that, he'll want to try to peel off Turkey. He's going to try to intimidate other NATO and EU countries based on these menacing deployments and so forth, and the belief that we're not reliable. So, yeah, I think it's extraordinarily damaging to our reputation, and we're going to see, I think, significant second and third order effects.
Thank you, Jen. I'm going to call on Rich Casey with a question, and then we do have to break for only a moment at 1:30. You've been gracious enough to agree to stay a little longer for us for questions, and we really thank you for that. Rich, your question, please.
Yeah, thank you, General McMaster. My question is very simple. Why should we care about Afghanistan when Pakistan, Iraq, Iran don't care? Why isn't it their problem? And the surrounding, don't just stop. The surrounding nations, Russia, India, Israel, and Saudi Arabia should take care of this problem, not America. Oh, the only reason we're in there is because of 9/11. The only reason. Tell me why we should stay there. I'm totally against everything you said about trying to influence Afghanistan.
Okay, well, you can be against it. That's all right. I mean, be against it, man. But hey, when these images keep coming back into your living room, of women being forced back into subjugation, mass murders and executions.
Not my
Hey,
problem. Not my problem.
no, okay, hey, that's fine. If you want to be heartless, you can be heartless, man. That's fine. And if you want to think that there's no ramification, that's fine too. That's okay. You can
Tell
be
me the
that way
ramification.
in our country. Well, the ramifications are clear, right?
What?
It's what we've seen already at 9/11. This is not a theoretical case, right?
No,
It's not
no.
a theoretical case that when these organizations have a safe haven, they become more dangerous. Do you remember the failed Times Square bombing just a few years ago? Do you know
Yeah.
why that failed? That failed because that guy was dodging our counterterrorism capabilities along the Pakistani border area. And you might want to say, okay, Pakistan take care of it. Really? Do you think Pakistan is acting in our interest? Do you think Iran is acting in our interest? Do you think Russia?
Who cares about our interests?
Russia and
Act
Iran,
in their interests.
Pakistan. Hey, I'm
Rich?
done talking to you, man. I answered your question. Next question.
I'm sorry.
Next
I
question.
talk too much.
No, and we didn't try to engage in a debate today. We really appreciate this. Let me do this though. For those people who have to leave at 1:30, our tradition is to remember to have a great week and a great weekend and all that's ahead, but also to know that if you're looking for inspiration, talk to a Rotarian. So I'm going to adjourn our meeting, but we'll go back to questions that I'll pose to you, General. Thank you. I have so many questions, General. I could keep here for hours. I want to thank all of our members for all their thoughtful questions, and I apologize to anybody whose questions I didn't ask. Was there something we could have done with the 20-year-olds and younger individuals who lived under the Taliban to change today's dynamic? And in fact, how could we have better won their hearts and minds?
Well, we did. I mean, sorry. So the 20-year-olds, I'm sorry. I don't know what the question is.
Could we have changed the younger generation, those that were 20 and younger?
We
so they'd be
did.
more
We
supportive?
did. The 20 and younger don't even have a memory of the Taliban, living under the Taliban. I mean, so the Taliban ended in 2001. Taliban rule over Afghanistan ended. And what you're seeing now are those who had enjoyed the freedoms that Afghans had enjoyed before actually Taliban rule, before Soviet occupation, especially in the 70s. People keep talking about, hey, why are we trying to transform Afghanistan? No, we're not trying to transform Afghanistan. We're just trying to help Afghanistan be Afghanistan again, right? Not to become Denmark. And so, I think that, and at a very extremely low level of effort, right? I mean, people, I think President Biden, others, they're still stuck like in 2008, 9, 10, right? We're talking about, we had 8,500 troops there when we started the capitulation negotiations, and we weren't taking casualties, right? The Afghans were bearing the brunt of the fight. So, I think that this younger generation, I mean, there is a youth bulge in I forget the exact stats, but I think it's like 85% of the population are under 30 or something in Afghanistan. And so, the Taliban, the Taliban's not going to have an easy time. I'm telling you. I mean, for those who are just wanting to write this off, I think there is going to be significant and growing resistance to the Taliban internally. Already you have Amrullah Saleh in control of the Panjshir Valley with about 10,000 fighters. They retook 4 districts yesterday. And I think that there is going to be an effort to try to at least create some safe havens, some safe areas where Afghans can congregate.
Let me ask you, General, some people have wondered, is the military structure in Afghanistan, has that been a problem over the past years with what they call the annual lobotomy, where we change the local military leaders every year, and that we don't have that long-term view of what's going on and what can be accomplished?
I think that's a factor. I think these short-term deployments in particular, especially those that are like 6 months, I think that those should have been extended. But of course, when you have a 20-year war, you have people who go back many, many times. The last commander in Afghanistan, Scott Miller, has relationships that he formed, since 2001. And so the same thing with Mick Nicholson, the previous commander. He had been there multiple times in multiple capacities. Knew all the Afghan leaders within the military as well as on the civilian side. So at the very senior level, it's not as much of a factor. But when you're operating alongside Afghan forces, this is really all about trust, right? I mean, we violated that trust as we threw them under the bus on our way out. But what makes combat units effective is confidence, right? People always want to count weapons, and look at numbers. but really the moral is to the physical as 10 to 1 is what Napoleon said. And a lot of that strength comes from the partnerships that we had with the Afghans and the bonds of trust and mutual respect and common purpose, right? That binds you together.
Another question that relates to that common purpose, we're Rotarians. We try to unite and help create lasting change. Some have questioned, should we have had a military role rather than a business role? So for instance, you've heard of the Chinese Belts and Roads policy, which sounds like they're giving money to buy love. Tell us about your view of that versus military roles.
Well, what they're trying to do is create servile relationships with countries, on the perimeter, but also globally by setting debt traps, for these countries. I call it in Battlegrounds a strategy of co-option, coercion, and concealment. Our role in Afghanistan was quite the opposite. We wanted to actually Afghanistan to increase its sovereignty, to be less of a ward of the international community or of us, right? And so I think our objectives were fundamentally different from those of the Chinese. The Chinese do want to extract minerals from Afghanistan. This is one of the reasons why they're paying off the Taliban in the northern part of the country. And this is one of the reasons why the Taliban was getting stronger, is because the Chinese and the Russians and the Iranians, all the people that your colleague thinks will maybe take care of the Taliban problem for us, we're actually paying them off and strengthening that organization and allowing it to regain power.
In light of that, why do you think the Afghan military faded so quickly? Folded like a deck of cards.
It was the psychological blows delivered to them. We didn't build in the resilience that we should have from the beginning, especially logistically, I would say. And they were overly dependent on us for logistics and medical evacuation and air support. They were always going to have to depend on us, right? It would take years and years to develop a capable Air Force and surveillance capability that would in any way, match what we could help them do at a very low cost ourselves. That's one of the reasons. But the main reason, it goes back to the Trump administration's negotiation with the Taliban without the Afghan government, right? So that was a blow to the Afghan government's legitimacy, but also to their security forces. We're thinking, man, are they about to throw us under the bus? And we did by forcing the prisoner release, which I mentioned, not insisting on a ceasefire, and then the last kind of nail in the coffin was President Biden's complete pullout of all the assets that were supporting them. And then stopping the active targeting of the Taliban or scaling it way back, and then the complete withdrawal, right? And so it was really the psychological blows that were much more severe. The psychological blows that we delivered were much more severe and landed harder on the Afghans than the physical blows that the Taliban delivered to them.
Interesting. Now, here's a question that might hit you personally.
If anybody wants to read more about this from an Afghan perspective, there was an op-ed in the New York Times like 2 days ago by Sami Sadat, and it's worth taking a look at.
Well, thank you. And who is he?
He was a corps commander in the Afghan army.
Oh, thank you.
And then became the army commander at the 11th hour, right before the collapse.
All right. Here's one that's directed to you personally. Could a commander in today's army succeed as you did at 73 Easton, which was a major battle that you led during the first Gulf War, in light of what we might call micromanaging of the military?
Yeah. Well, I hope that our culture of mission orders and decentralized execution based on the mission orders and encouraging subordinates to take initiative is still central to our military culture. I believe it is, right? And I think, of course, that depends in large measure on the command climate, the environment that commanders establish, within their organization. And in today's complex fights that we're in, you do need commanders, leaders that are forward to be able to make decisions in contact with the enemy without having to wait for orders. Now, there are a lot of aspects to that. It's the culture that you establish. It's the underwriting of risk and underwriting of mistakes. But it's also providing the assets that a commander needs in a decentralized manner and making the mission clear, right? Hey, if you don't know what you're doing, how do you take initiative to accomplish that mission? I would just say, what is the mission right now in Afghanistan? Is it just get the hell out? Or is it to get all Americans out first? I don't know if it's to get all Americans out first, because it doesn't look to me that if that was the mission, we would be doing what we're doing today. It looks like what we're doing today is prioritizing withdrawal over everything else.
And you believe Biden should be doing something different now?
Absolutely.
Now, let me ask you if we have the separation of civilians overlooking the military and what have you, and yet we've certainly had a number of military people elected in political office. What does the military do to help educate the sitting president? You have sat with the sitting president as national security advisor. What happens on a regular basis to educate our civilian government?
Well, it really depends in large measure on the national security advisor and how the national security advisor sees his or her role. I saw it as my role to coordinate and integrate across the departments and agencies to give the president the benefit of the best advice and the best assessments. And then also to always give the president multiple options so the president could determine his agenda. And then once he made a decision, that we could assist with the sensible implementation in an integrated way across the government and with like-minded partners internationally and oftentimes in the private sector as well. And that worked. It worked. Now, Donald Trump was not an easy person, to staff and to assist in decision making. That's not a surprise to anybody. But this approach worked well, and I had the benefit of reading, writing, researching about decisions that led to an American war in Vietnam. And I went into the job determined not to make the same mistakes that McGeorge Bundy made when he was serving Lyndon Johnson in the period in which Vietnam became an American war. And those mistakes involved not spending enough time thinking about the nature of the challenge to our security, not taking enough time to inventory our national interests at stake, to explain clearly, so what? Why do Americans care? Why is it our interests to intervene or to engage in a certain range of foreign policy or national security actions along with others? And then to craft overarching goals and more specific objectives. During the lead up to the Vietnam War, McGeorge Bundy argued, hey, it's better not to have objectives, because then if we don't accomplish them, we can always say, oh, that was never our objective anyway. And that would, quote, give the president more flexibility in the domestic political arena. The other aspect of the Vietnam decision making that I took on was to try to insulate the national security decision making process when really the stakes are oftentimes life and death from partisan politics. And I removed the so-called strategist off of the permanent committee of principals committee of the National Security Council, and we framed these challenges in a way that did not consider partisan political advantages of various courses of action, knowing, okay, there are going to be people who have the presidency here who talk to them about that as part of the decision making in other ways. And then finally, I insisted that we always present the president with multiple options, because it's in the presentation of multiple options that you can consider the long-term costs and consequences. And that's what I did, is I described it on the South Asia strategy, but I write about this in the conclusion of Battlegrounds as well, about how we structured the process to avoid really buying into implicit and flawed assumptions, which oftentimes are the worst thing that can happen in terms of providing kind of a flawed rationale for folly, and then also to set up a process that would not try to drive the president toward one favored course of action, but would explore all of them, and in doing so, expose the advantages and disadvantages of each.
Well, thank you, General. You've certainly exposed us to a lot today. We really, really appreciate it. It's not just the military that's quote unquote attacked sometimes. You've heard the phrase over your life about how, oh, why spend money sending a man to the moon when we could spend it on our own infrastructure or our healthcare or something. Same thing is being said about our military expenses. Why spend so much on military to support a far distant country where there's so much corruption? Why not fix our own crumbling infrastructure? What's your response to those kinds of comments?
Well, what I would just say is, we exist to deter conflict and then to protect our nation when an enemy takes a hostile act against us. And I think what we should have learned from 9/11, what we should have learned actually from COVID-19 even, is that problems and challenges to our security that develop abroad can only be dealt with at an exorbitant cost once they reach our shores. And for relatively small investments of forward position capable joint forces, we, alongside our allies and partners, establish a deterrent capability that that convinces our enemies that they can't accomplish their objectives through the use of force. You know, I like to quote G.K. Chesterton on anything. I mean, I think you can't go wrong reading anything he's written. The collection of his essays in defense of sanity is I recommend to everybody. But in it, he said, war is not the best way of settling differences, but it may be the only way to ensure they're not settled for you, right? And of course, it was George Washington who, very early in the history of our republic, said the most effectual means of preserving peace is to be prepared for war. So that's what I think you get from our military, which I think, if you look at it as a percentage of GDP, is relatively small, especially when you consider that we're spending under 4% of our GDP on defense, and we sent checks to Americans over this past year equivalent to 16% of GDP. So, I think that, you look at the defense budget, you think, wow, it's massive. But I think what you get for it is the prevention of war and the degree of security that allows us to remain free and prosperous.
Thank you, General. We want to do you a favor, though. Could you hold up your book for us, and we'll tell people how it's available on Amazon and elsewhere?
I don't know. I took the obnoxious cover off that has my mug on it. That's Battlegrounds and Dereliction of Duty right there. Some perfect beach reading for everybody.
Right.
I'll tell you, and for your colleague who was challenging me, I have skin in this, right? I buried too many of my soldiers who fought in this war, and you know what? Soldiers don't want to be pitied, though. What soldiers want is they want political leadership who are committed to achieving an outcome that's worthy of the sacrifices they make. And so, if I seem angry and frustrated, it's because I am. And if you want to understand more why and have the patience to do so, the 2 chapters on South Asia in the book explain what I describe, as our serial gullibility in connection with Pakistan, and the short-term approach to a long-term problem, which resulted in this not being a 20-year war, but being a 1-year war fought 20 times over.
So true. Well, thank you so very much. It's been the most thoughtful program. We can't thank you enough for being with us. I'm sorry we have to adjourn. Surprisingly, one of our committees has a meeting that's going to take over our Zoom.
Hey, well, I hope to see you around the neighborhood. I'm in the Hoover Tower right now. I'm in the literal ivory tower, so I'm sure I can see some of your homes from here.
Right.
Take care.
And
Bye,
thank you
everybody.
for all that you've done for this country.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.